Welcome, gentle listener. I am Baldermort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the factions, phases, and forces of the Warhammer 40K setting. The grim darkness of the far future, where there is no time for peace. There is only time for war. And today, we shall be taking a look at the very newest lore and how it moves forward the overall storyline in the setting. Taken from White Dwarf issue 500 and 496, let us hear how the Necron-generated pariah Nexes have brought a new dynamic to the wars of the time. And so, as usual, to quote. "10th edition lore update. The Nephilim anomaly. Within the boundaries of the Nephilim sector, rages a devastating conflict. Imperial and Necron forces do battle through abandoned cityscapes and in the shadow of vast blackstone pylons. Yet these belligerents are not the only factions with designs upon this pariah nexus, for others spy opportunities amidst the fighting. The ongoing war in the Nephilim anomaly involves three primary factions. The combined Imperial forces of battle groups Kalides and Orpheus, Necrons who have pledged their allegiance to Zazarek, the Silent King, and the legions of Imhotep the Stormlord, Pharaon of the Sautek dynasty. As Imperial forces seek to shatter whatever is causing the inertial miasma that shrouds the pariah nexus, Zazarek finds his strength split between defeating the surprisingly stubborn humans and simultaneously driving back Imhotep and his vassal dynasties. All three factions unleash a horrifying array of technological and arcane nightmares upon one another, but others are drawn into the violence or seek to exploit the conflict and must themselves contend with the terrible effects of the stilling. The Rangers of Aeldari. Of all the Necrons' many foes, none are more bitter than the Aeldari. Countless eons ago, their ascent to power was one of the primary factors that forced the Necrons into hibernation. The subsequent fall of their stellar empire reduced the Aeldari to a splintered and dying species, with only a fraction of their former power. Those that remain, most notably the Asuryani of the Aeldari craft worlds, still retain inherited knowledge of the galaxy-spanning conflict known as the War in Heaven, and the bitter battles fought against the Necrons. Thus, the Aeldari possess a lingering enmity for those most ancient foes. Within the Asuryani, those of craftworld Aeldari are perhaps the most committed in their opposition to the Necrons. They have long sought to prevent the resurgence of their ancient enemies, and their outcasts have devoted much time and resources to monitoring and, where possible, eliminating Necron foes. The accelerated awakening of the Necrons has not gone unnoticed by the Asuryani, and the reverberations of the Silent King's return have been perceived by farseers far and wide. It was Ilokushe of Aeldari who peered into the Imperium and divined from its intertwined strands the prophecy of risen doom. She alone sang to the sea of dead stars, and amidst the tangled web of fate foresaw a new threat to the fabric of reality. The progressive emergence of several growing empiric anomalies within regions known to harbour Necron tomb worlds showed Shea's prophetic warnings to be well-founded. Thus, elements of Aeldari's vast network of rangers and shroud runners rallied to action and deployed to these afflicted regions. Aeldari's farseers hoped that these agents would become Aeldari's eyes in these psychically impenetrable regions and ascertain the true level of threat they posed. On world after world, the Rangers of Aeldari encountered similar scenes of devastation. Entire human civilizations seemed to have simply collapsed. The populations of settlements were either absent or lay immobile where they had fallen, sightless eyes staring vacantly, bodies slowly wasting away. The Rangers, too, suffered greatly from the stultifying effect of the pariah nexus. The stilling, as it is known to the humans, proved, if anything, more devastating to the Aeldari, for they have a far more pronounced connection to the Imperium than humans, and therefore found the enervating energies to weigh even more heavily upon their souls. Many rangers were overcome, lapsing with frightening speed into a fugue state from which they could not be roused. Other horrifying side effects of the contra-empiric matrix manifested themselves more subtly, causing victims to hallucinate cavorting demonic entities, demonstrate paranoia, and ultimately lose their grip on reality. Many outcasts were forced to retreat, making the long journey back to Alatok to seek treatment for their stricken comrades. Only the most disciplined proved capable of staving off the stilling's effects long enough to return field reports to their craft world. None, however, were wholly spared from its effects. They found their psychoreactive equipment affected by the warp-dampening aura. Long-rife targeting systems and other psychically activated equipment malfunctioned, and most disturbing of all, waystones failed to function correctly. Ordinarily, these stones, worn by the vast majority of Asuryani, ensnared the spirits of the bearer upon their death, ensuring that their essence remains free from Slanesh and can instead be returned to the infinity circuit of their craft world. Within the bounds of the Necrons' nodal matrix, however, this process seemed to be disrupted. The spirit stones gathered from those who had fallen within Pariah Nexus lacked their normal luster, instead appearing milky and dull, and emanating an aura of lethargy and sorrow. Those seers who examine these tainted stones speak of an emptiness within, as if the contra-empiric energies of the Pariah Nexus afflict the spirits of the dead as much as they do the living. None of the spirits contained within these corrupted stones have yet been returned to the infinity circuit of Alatok for fear of the spiritual malaise spreading through the craft world's core. Despite the spiritual and physical dangers they face within the Nephilim anomaly, the Rangers of Alatok have continued to scout these regions on behalf of their craft world. In response to the information returned to them, Alatok's Farseers have opted to manipulate the conflict from afar, rather than commit their strength to battle in unfavorable circumstances. Understanding that humanity's fight against the Necrons, for once, aligns with their own goals, Alatok's leadership have put aside their contempt for the Monkey, as they refer to the humans, and authorized several clandestine strikes on Necrons designed to relieve pressure upon the beleaguered forces of the Imperium. Unwilling to deploy forces en masse and risk losing them to the Stilling, Alatok instead relies upon strategic assaults, their forces striking via webway gates and then retreating through them before the effects of the Stilling become too severe. The foremost of the craftworld's pathfinders, Eric Nightspear, has been particularly active in this region. At Iloku Shea's instigation, Nightspear seeks to escalate the conflict between Imhotep and the Silent King through acts of assassination, misdirection, and sabotage. An unprecedented extravaganza. Few sentient beings were spared the effects of the Necrons' nodal matrix. Even orcs, whose innate physical and psychological resilience renders them immune to many afflictions, have shown aberrant behavior that some human and Necron observers attribute to the Nephilim anomaly. Before the activation of the Necron pylon array, orcs of War Smashercrack had been engaged in attacks on the southeastern edge of the Nephilim sector and had acted in typical orcish fashion. They had amassed huge hordes under the leadership of the largest and most aggressive war bosses, and then engaged in brutally straightforward assaults, relying upon overwhelming numbers and ferocity to crush Necron and Imperial forces alike. As the nodal matrix continues to grow, enveloping the systems the orcs were fighting in, so did their hordes meet with greater success. The orcs sweeping over worlds whose populations were already beginning to feel the effects of the Stilling. Yet the further they pressed into the bounds of the Nephilim sector, the fewer enemies presented themselves. The orcs, spoiling for a fight, found only isolated pockets of resistance upon which to vent their aggression. More of the worlds they invaded had long since fallen victim to the Stilling, leaving few humans capable of putting up a decent fight. Further battles were fought between Orc and Necrons, but the momentum of the Orc invasion had already begun to slow. Orc forces began to drift apart, engaging in infighting, whilst the continual influx of fresh Orcs that had marked the initial stages of the invasion began to slow. Necron cryptex observing the effects of the nodal matrix posited that its aura affected the Orks by inhibiting the Gestalt aura of the Waaagh. Where once a single Ork may have, through strength and brutality, been able to bring together a vast army, now war bosses struggled to maintain control over more than a handful of warriors as Waaagh Smasher-Crack began to fall apart. However, there were those amongst the Ork ranks who saw an opportunity upon the Nephilim anomaly's silent worlds. As the infighting and power struggles raged around them, the more technologically gifted mechs and big mechs found abandoned tech and empty factorums galore. Just as the Stilling split apart the Waaagh, a wave of spontaneous innovation rippled through the minds of these maniacal inventors, leaving the majority of their fellow Orks to their internecine struggles. The mechs sifted through humanity's abandoned and mechanical treasures. On the manufacturing world of Lok, Grugok Wurblitzer, a mech of particular renown amongst the tribe, brought tracked monstrosities from humanity's crashed void ships, abandoned battle tanks, and plasma generators. He fitted them with an array of weapons that he and his grot servants had scavenged and altered to his own insane specifications. These he turned against his rival mechs, reducing those who crossed him to smears of gore with gigantic super zap guns, splatter cannons, and other madcap weapons. Other mechs too crafted monstrous machines of war and turned them against their opponents. The escalating use of nightmarish doomsday weapons between the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus and Necron cryptex within the wider Nephilim anomaly has only served to inspire the insane Ork mechs who witnessed them to forge their own devastating weapons. With the abundant resources left abandoned throughout the Nephilim sector, it seems such weapons are limited only by the imagination of their architect. Asteroid-mounted bubble chuckers of colossal size and destructive potential, gravity-manipulating tractor cannons capable of hurling moons and other celestial bodies from their orbit, and supersized teleporters with the power to transport entire armies. These devices and more add their own terrible might to the conflict. One of the most intimidating Ork mechs in the Nephilim sector, Grugok Wurblitzer, managed to rally several mobs to his side and struck at the quarry world of Alkeron. Unbeknownst to Wurblitzer, Alkeron was home to rich veins of Noctilith mined by servitors and prisoners overseen by tech priests. The small colony was defended only by a garrison of Astra Militarum soldiers, rendering it vulnerable to Wurblitzer's hastily assembled force. Having overwhelmed the Imperial defenders with a swift and bloody invasion, Wurblitzer gazed upon the Blackstone for the first time. He knew at once that the smooth black rock held great power, and a flash of inspiration rippled across his mind's eye. After ransacking the blood-drenched mining facility and taking a bounty of the Ebon Stone, Wurblitzer set about incorporating it into the internal mechanisms of power fields, guided by visions he cared not to acknowledge, let alone explain. He mounted these Blackstone-infused mechanisms atop vehicles, walkers, swig beasts, and power armor. The resultant power fields seemed to have restored the natural aggression of nearby Orks, stirring once more the Waaagh that had waned since entering the Pariah Nexus. Bolstered by these positively charged Blackstone totems, the Gestalt power of the Waaagh seems to grow once again in power, albeit only within the bounds of those crackling and unstable power fields. With Wurblitzer's creation suppressing the effects of the nodal matrix, at least on a local level, the Orks have begun a new wave of attacks upon Necron and human territories, seeking to seize more Noctilith, improve the technology, and rally even more directionless Orks to the fight. Kin mercenary and salvagers. The Kin are an opportunistic species who have no compunction about exploiting tragedy and bloodshed for the betterment of kindred and league. This attitude has seen them thrive within the galactic core for millennia, and enables them to persist and prosper even in the face of disastrous galactic events. The raging conflict unfolding across the Nephilim sector has provided the opportunity for competing leagues to harvest raw resources, forge alliances, and settle grudges. In the earliest days following the opening of the Great Rift, before the activation of the Necrons' nodal matrix, the Imperium's overwhelming military strength precluded the establishment of any long-term holds in the Nephilim sector, and kin activities in this region of the galaxy had been limited to small-scale scouting and mining missions. The sudden emergence of the Necrons and their arcane pylons in the region, coupled with the unexpected and dimly understood effects of the Silling upon the human populace, afforded an unexpected opportunity for enrichment to the boldest and most ambitious of kin pioneers. With human populations falling into the grip of an enervating malaise, and the ability of Imperial armies to communicate and travel severely impeded, the Imperium's capacity to prevent the kin from seizing raw resources was a weakness to be exploited. The Necron's nodal matrix has a lesser effect upon the majority of kin, whose souls shine far more dimly within the Imperium and are hardened against spiritual afflictions. Whilst they are not immune to the nodal matrix's enervating pall, and some have suffered extreme fatigue if exposed for too long, no instances have yet been recorded of kin succumbing fully to the Stilling in the same fashion as the Nephilim sector's human population. The nature of kin warp travel, reliant as it is upon shorter, more precise warp plunges, means that their ship's ability to travel through the Nephilim anomaly is less impeded than that of human or orc vessels. Thus, stoic, Hernkin explorers have spent a great deal of time within this region. Their colossal mining vessels have stripped asteroid fields, moons, and half-abandoned Imperial worlds of their material wealth. Of particular interest to the Hernkin prospects is the preponderance of blackstone, the properties of which have long been known to the Brockiers of a great many guilds. The kin have found many uses for this material, with the Brockiers of many leagues incorporating it into the barrier tech wielded by their psychically sensitive Grimnir. The aggressive pursuit of blackstone by Necron and humans alike has spurred the Hernkin to locate, mark, and facilitate the extraction of as much of this sought-after material as possible. The Necrons, however, are unwilling to cede such a valuable resource to the kin without a fight. A coalition of allied leagues, led by Karl Narok of the Urani Surtur Regulates, engaged Necrons of the Hotek dynasty, a vassal of the mighty Cesarkhan, in a full-scale conflict over the blackstone deposits of the Ulbar system. It was here that the kin first encountered one of the Necron's skyscraper pylons, emerging from the crust of the planet Kethrok, crown world of the Hotek dynasty. The subsequent fighting saw the Necrons summon reinforcements to protect the structure. Narok, experienced in fighting the Necrons of the Samnok dynasty across the core-bound territories of his kindred, has determined that Kethrok's valuable natural resources, blackstone included, warrant a prolonged campaign against a committed Necron foe. Covens and Cabals. Wherever the winding paths of the webway cross into reality, so do the Drukhari of Kormorah emerge from the dark city to inflict agonies upon the unwary. The Nephilim sector has long suffered at the hands of these cruel raiders, for it is a populous region filled with prized targets. Indeed, before the opening of the Great Rift, these Aeldari pirates, as the Drukhari were identified, were viewed by the officers of Imperial Sector Command as one of the primary threats to the settlements within the region. The Cabal of the Last Hatred enjoyed close relations with the Aeldari corsairs known as the Midnight Cadre, who operate within the Grav Reefs, Nebula, and asteroid fields along the west edge of the Nephilim sector. The Last Hatred regularly traded weapons and esoteric treasures with the Corsairs in exchange for information on lightly defended human worlds that may prove vulnerable to real space raids. Then came the Necrons. The flaring into existence of the Necrons' contra-empiric matrix afflicted the Drukhari caught within its bounds. Like all Aeldari, the Drukhari are gifted or cursed with latent psychic sensitivities. However, their abject fear of Slaanesh has caused the denizens of the Dark City to suppress their abilities for fear of attracting the attentions of She Who Thirsts. The Cabalite raiders of the Last Hatred at first thought the effects of the Stilling may be beneficial to their cause, recognizing that its warp-suppressing effects greatly reduced the risk of Slaanesh's demons breaking through the veil to hunt their Drukhari prey. Whilst the prior nexuses, at first appeared to be potential refugees beyond the webway, it soon transpired that there was a price to pay. To prevent their souls from being slowly consumed by Slaanesh, all Drukhari must rejuvenate themselves by absorbing the pain and torment of others. Ordinarily, their vicious real space raids provide an opportunity to feast upon the agonies of others. However, the enervating aura of the Pariah Nexus has the effect of diminishing the physical and emotional responses of their victims, thereby inhibiting the ability of the raiders themselves to draw sustenance from torture and death. The delectable terror and sickly sweet pain that sustained the Cormorite raiders is greatly diluted, rendering even the most agonizing and gruesome death unsatisfying indeed. Whilst the last hatred and the witch cults of the Forked Tongue and Cursed Blade find ever-diminishing returns within the stilled regions of the Nephilim sector, other Drukhari factions find their own way of exploiting the situation. Homunculi of the Ebon Sting and the Prophets of Flesh have undertaken new ventures within the Nexus. The opportunity to harvest stilled victims, both human and animal in nature, is one that cannot be passed. Thus, aboard raider transports, the homunculi continue to conduct regular harvesting expeditions into the heart of the Pariah Nexus, gathering up stilled humans and other sentient creatures and reducing their flesh to bubbling ingredients for their next batch of monstrous creations. These activities have brought the Drukhari into conflict with the Necrons. Illuminor Caesaris, whose macabre experiments require the stilled bodies of sentient beings, has come to see the Drukhari as thieving impediments to his works and directed a sliver of his intellect to eliminate the threat. Those systems on the southeastern border of the Nephilim anomaly have become the site of constant skirmishes between the already overstretched forces of the Sharakan dynasty and the flesh-wrought monstrosities fielded by Drukhari homunculi, as both factions fight over the right to dissect, torture and enslave the remnants of the human populace. War in the Nodal Matrix. In the waning years of the 41st millennium, Caesarak, the Silent King, set a grand new plan into motion. Having secured the twisted genius of Illuminor Caesaris, the original architect of biotransference, he began the construction of a number of what he termed contra-immaterial nodal matrices around the fringes of the galaxy. The greatest of these sites was discovered by the Imperium shortly after the ending of the Noctis Eterna, and was variously named the Pariah Nexus, the Zone of Silence, or the Nephilim Anomaly. The nodal matrices employed colossal pylons fashioned from noctilith, a substance that could be polarized either to attract or violently repel the energies of the warp, to create regions of space closed off to the Imperium. Within their bounds, psychic communication was almost impossible. Warp currents were dangerously becalmed, and creatures of flesh and blood suffered a slow degeneration of the soul that humanity came to call the stilling. Eventually, this effect reduced most living creatures to hollow husks, their autonomic functions still active, but all animus and sentience gone from them. It was Caesarak's hope that these empty shells could be harvested and employed as vessels into which the minds and spirits of his own people could be transferred. In short, the Silent King not only planned to steadily cut real space off from the dangers of the warp, but he further sought to reverse the curse of biotransference that his choices had inflicted on his people, as well as to return the Necrons to a new life of flesh. It was not only the sentient species trapped within the Pariah Nexus who fought against this insidious plan. News reached Imhotep of Caesarak's efforts, and it displeased him greatly. Already, the Stormlord had poured scorn on the return of the Silent King. To Imhotep's mind, Caesarak had both failed and betrayed the Necrons before abandoning them. The one thing that the Silent King had done right, by the Stormlord's reckoning, was to clad the Necron populace in formidable bodies built for the galactic reconquest they must surely undertake. Now, it seemed, Caesarak was set on undoing even this one success. The longer Imhotep brooded upon the news, the more it enraged him. Though outwardly he maintained his grim and indomitable countenance, inside he seethed. Imhotep had made no pretense of bending the knee to Cesarek after the Silent King's return to the galaxy. He had even permitted his subordinate nobles and clad dynasties to clash with Cesarican legions on more than one occasion. But now he decided he must go further. The Silent King had to be proven unfit to rule the Necrons, as well as his dynasty along with him. If the Sautek were to complete their galactic conquest and assume their rightful, indeed logical, place as the rulers of the Necron Galactic Empire, then civil war was required. Thus, even as war raged between battle groups of the humans' Indomitus Crusade and the Necron garrison forces of the Prior Nexus, Imhotep launched several calculated strikes of his own into that region. The Imperial hosts and, as much through necessity as grand strategic intent, secured footholds to the galactic northwest and southeast of the nodal matrix. Imhotep, therefore, began his own campaign in the northeast reaches of the Nexus, striking against several remote systems whose worlds were defended by a mixture of Cesarican legions and those of lesser vassal nobles sworn to the Silent King. In the campaign that followed, Imhotep was careful to observe every detail of the codes of honor. He offered his enemies notice of his onset, gave them every chance to retreat before him unharmed, and allowed them to substitute full-blown armed conflict for single combat of champions, so as to avoid damaging the Necrons' wider potential to resist the younger peoples. Imhotep embodied all that, to his mind, defined true respect for the triarchal codes laid down before even the war in heaven had been fought, making it clear that he defied not the traditional dynastic values, but only he who currently claimed the title of Silent King. Imhotep's strategic and political cunning bore fruit. Where he defeated Cesarican legions, he did so honorably and always after sufficient provocation. Where he avoided battle entirely, he projected the mane of an entitled conqueror whose cause must surely be as unimpeachable as his conduct. Such notions struck a chord with many lesser Necron nobles of those dynasties sworn to the Silent King, some of whom had begun to harbor their own quiet doubts about Cesarek's methods and goals. By the time Imhotep had driven his enemies from his target systems, he had seized a foothold in the nodal matrix and gained mastery of multiple strategically useful dolmen gates. He also sent ripples of doubt rolling out through those whom the Silent King counted as loyal vassals. As the war in the Prior Nexus escalated, Imhotep not only drew much-needed Cesarican forces away from the front lines of the Necron-human conflict, he also swayed a number of the Silent King's vassal dynasties, or breakaway nobles thereof, to flock to his own banner. Between this and the Stormlord's methodical and expertly placed offensives, Imhotep not only expanded his own territories within the nodal matrix, but also applied ever more pressure to the Silent King. Doubtless, this contributed to Cesarek's decision to unleash the full forbidden might of the Technomandrites and their terrible weapons upon the humans. It was this choice in turn that saw yet more wavering nobles abandon the Silent King in favor of the Stormlord, and drew the allegiance of no less a luminary than Orikon the Diviner. The battle lines of the civil war between the Sautek and Cesarican dynasties had been drawn across the northeast fringe of the nodal matrix, but Imhotep's grand strategy was only just beginning to play out. End quote. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. If you enjoyed this short video, then please do consider liking and subscribing. Also, check out the notes to the video, as there may be things of worth to you there. I'll leave you to discover. And thank you for your precious time. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. To Toodaloo.